Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. For this episode, I would say we have a fairly decently sized cybersecurity episode. We got a lot of cybersecurity themes throughout this episode, as you could probably tell from the title of this episode. But before we get into all of that fun stuff from various news stories about security vulnerabilities and potential spyware usage in mainline operating systems, let's get into this week's trivia question. So Google used to sell a server called the Google Search Appliance, which was a rack-mountable server that was based on what famous enterprise server family, or I guess model? So what currently produced enterprise server was the Google Search Appliance based off of? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, before we get into the cybersecurity tip, I did mention we have some various news stories in relation to cybersecurity. So this first one comes from CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, about a vulnerability in the Linux kernel that was a known exploited vulnerability, essentially meaning that this was exploited in the wild. So it is something that you will definitely want to make sure that you patch as soon as possible. But basically, what this vulnerability is a use after free vulnerability. So essentially, memory that has been freed is then reaccessed after it has already been freed, which can cause all kinds of undefined behavior. In this case, it will allow a local attacker to escalate privileges from a regular user to a root user, and thereby being able to execute arbitrary code as a root user, basically giving them whatever privilege whatever they want to do, they can do it. So this only scored, I say only scored a 7.8. Now, you might be, if you're not as in tuned with how these CVEs are scored, you might be wondering why this vulnerability that allows privilege escalation and arbitrary code execution doesn't score like a perfect 10 like the XZ vulnerability that we talked about a few weeks ago, that will allow an attacker to essentially execute whatever commands they want as the root user. And the reason for that is, unlike the XZ vulnerability, for example, this vulnerability, you need to have physical access to the system. So it's not something that you can exploit remotely. So if you don't actually have physical access to the system, you're not going to be able to exploit this vulnerability, thus lowering the score a little bit. So that's one of the things to note, where you'll sometimes see vulnerabilities similar to this that have a score that's not a perfect 10, even though you can get privilege escalation and, be able to run arbitrary code. It really depends on how you get access to that, right? Like, if it's something that you have to have physical access for, that's not going to be nearly as severe as something that can just be done remotely over the internet, right? Because if you can be a threat actor in your PJs, just chilling on the couch and hacking into servers, that's of course a lot more critical than if you actually have to put on your big boy pants and actually break into, some kind of enterprise's actual office to get physical access to a system. Of course, don't be a threat actor in general, but that is essentially, what we mean here when we're talking about the differences in these scores. So with that, let's move into this week's cybersecurity tip. This week's cybersecurity tip is about encryption. So, if you've listened to the podcast for long enough, you'll know that I am a big advocate of encryption, and I think it's something that you should be using, especially on any kind of personally identifiable information like your address, banking information, social security numbers, all that good stuff. You should definitely be encrypting if you're storing digital copies of it. Another great way to do this without having to really even think about it is doing a full disk encryption. And basically every single operating system nowadays offers this. Mac OS has it, Windows has it, Linux has it. So it is definitely a feature that, in my personal opinion, you definitely should be using. And other devices like, for example, the iPhone have it enabled by default. But when it comes to encryption is only as good as you let it. And what do I mean by that? Because, yeah, I mean, there are some, encryption schemes out there like AES that are, top of the line, top notch, but it's only as good as you let it. And what I mean by that is, in instances like AES, you have to essentially use a password in order to encrypt and decrypt the information. Now, if you have a super weak password, you might have a good encryption scheme protecting your data, but the password to unlock your data is very weak. Thus, you could argue how good is your encryption really if it's really easy to break in that case. Same thing with full disk encryption, because how full disk encryption works is when your machine is fully shut off and powered down, your disk is encrypted. So if someone tries to get physical access to your system and either remove the drive or they plug in a boot USB to boot into another operating system and mount your drive that way, they won't be able to get anything off of your drive because it's encrypted. However, if your machine's unlocked and powered on, your drive is decrypted. So if someone were able to get physical access to your system, they would be able to extract whatever data they wanted to. So this is actually one of the exploits, if you will, that federal agencies will actually use to take down various threat actors and other dark web actors. And a common way that they tend to do this is first off, of course, they have to identify who the person is in real life, which they can do through numerous ways. It generally comes down to a failure of the threat actor or dark web actors, OPSEC or operational security. Basically, somewhere they find a place where they let slip something personal, and then through that thread they can identify and unmask who this person really is. But anyway, once they identify who the person is, they identify a time and place where the target essentially isn't going to be suspecting of anything. So, for example, I believe it was the story of the operator of the Silk Road on the dark web, which there's plenty of stories going into that whole story. So, if you're interested, you can go look at them. But essentially, the person that was running it was, I believe how he got caught was he was at like I want to say it was a public library, or he was in some public space, and essentially there was some kind of like staged event or something, and then he kind of got up to investigate essentially, and then the feds kind of swooped in and grabbed his laptop while he was logged into the Silk Road, and of course it was decrypted because he was actively logged into it. And there's another similar story with the Alpha Bay instance, how they took down the head guy there. It was a very similar instance where he was logged into his computer. They caught him off guard, essentially staging an accident outside of his house to lure him outside, and then they would, swoop in, grab his laptop, and get all the data off of it. So, I guess if you wanted to take something from these incidences, it's if something weird happens, make sure you lock your computer or shut it off before you investigate, I guess. But essentially, what I really wanted to do with this was just kind of drive the point home that just because you use encryption doesn't mean that you're safe. You have to ensure that because like I said, your encryption is only good as you let it be. So if you always have your device unlocked or you just leave it unlocked or unattended, it doesn't matter if your device is encrypted if it's unlocked like that. Or if you're using weak passwords to decrypt your encrypted data. So that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, before we get into some of the nerdy stuff I got up to, I wanted to touch on another vulnerability that surfaced, which was another exploit in a WordPress plugin. Now, we've talked on a few different occasions over the course of this podcast of various different vulnerabilities that have occurred within WordPress. And this is, I guess, more to add to the list. So if you needed any further, reasoning why you shouldn't use WordPress, and just, write the code yourself, here's another one. Now, I understand creating a website can be daunting, and no, this isn't some segue into some website sponsor or anything like that, because if we're being quite honest, I am by no means a web developer. If you've listened to the podcast for long enough, you know that I very much enjoy writing in programming languages like C, C++, and even getting into some Python and Java occasionally. So very much not doing web-based stuff. But I do have a couple of websites that I have, and those are essentially all just raw HTML and CSS. So it is possible to make a website without using something like WordPress. And if you have any little bit of programming knowledge, I would definitely recommend you do that, because another benefit that you can have by coding it yourself is you can essentially host it for free by using either GitLab pages or using GitHub pages or some other. Most Git repos allow you to host websites. And if you're using something like GitHub or GitLab, for instance, you can essentially host them for free. The only thing you'd technically have to pay for if you wanted it would be a custom domain. But even that, you technically don't even have to pay for if you just want to use the default domain name that they give you. But anyway, we're kind of getting off topic here. But basically, the vulnerability here was essentially a cross-site scripting attack, which we probably should do an actual episode that dives into specifically what that is. But essentially, what's going on here is this cross-site scripting attack is allowing for attackers to inject malicious scripts into the WordPress plugin here. And basically, the reason that this is even possible, I believe, was actually due to a lack of sanitation when it comes to input. Yeah, so it says in this the hackernews.com article that I'm referencing, which I'll have linked in the show notes, it says the cross-site scripting attacks due to inadequate input sanitation and output escaping. So, which allows possibility for attackers to inject malicious scripts. So how many times on the podcast have we talked about how you need to verify your user input and not just blindly, pass it along, and to always sanitize your input? This is another classic example of why you need to do that, because if you don't, things like this can happen. So yeah. If you're using WordPress, definitely make sure that you check the plugins that you're using to make sure you're not vulnerable. But my personal recommendation, if you're using WordPress, is to convert it to just a static or just a regular, website with actual code. Then you don't have to worry about the various vulnerabilities that come up. But that's just my personal recommendation. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So, starting off with the video game updates. So over the past few weeks, I have talked about how I was creating what I was calling an asset compiler, which will essentially take, the images, the fonts, when I eventually get there, the audio for the video game I'm making, and essentially convert those files into like C and C++ header files, so I can include them directly into the video game source code itself without actually having to make any kind of system calls to the file system to actually pull those and load those assets in. Now, this is still very much experimental. I'm still trying to decide if this is something I want to do long term, but I finally got around to actually integrating this in this what I'm calling embedded mode, where I embed the assets directly into the executable. I finally got around to integrating that actually in the source code. Now, like I mentioned, I've been working on adding this support for a while, and I had the build system already set up and configured to build not only the assets but also the requisite compiler flags to tell my source code that I want to embed these images. I just hadn't gotten around to actually implementing those changes actually into the source code itself. But I got around to doing that this week, and I did notice something, that the asset compiler actually would have. It basically created an issue with the C++ compiler that I was using. And basically what happened was, specifically with fonts, the asset compiler, which essentially in this case with fonts is just a wrapper for the export font as code function from the raylib library, I noticed an issue where when I would try to call the load font function that gets generated by this export font as code function, it would throw an error with C++, essentially complaining that I'm trying to cast a constant array to a pointer, and it would just fail to compile and just crash essentially the compiler and wouldn't be able to build successfully. So, being a good open source developer, I did two things. The first thing I did was implement a temporary patch into the asset compiler to fix the issue by essentially adding a cast to that, so when I am trying to set my pointer equal to that constant array, I'm essentially just casting the constant array as just a generic pointer, so it'll allow me to do it and compile without issues. And the way I did this was I did it based on an if, a pound define if check. So I think I've talked about what those are on the podcast before, but essentially what that means is when you do a pound define like that, like with the pound if, what that essentially means is during compile time, the compiler will check to see if that condition is met, and if it is, it includes that code. Otherwise, if it's not met, it doesn't include the code at all. So essentially what this will mean is I have a check in there to check the raylib library version, and if it meets a certain value, in this case version 5, the code to apply the patch will be included. But if it's greater than version 5, so whenever version 5.1 comes out, for instance, that patch will not be included. So that's essentially what's going on. That's how I implemented it. And the second thing that I did was I was combing. So first I did that just basic patch in my asset compiler. Then the second thing I did was I combed through the source code of the raylib library to try to figure out where this how this auto-generated code was being made. And I was looking through it, and I noticed the change to actually patch this issue that I was facing was very trivial. So what I did was, as a good open source developer, I forked the project. I cloned it to my local machine. I made the 2 lines worth of changes that I needed to make, committed it, pushed it back up, submitted a pull request to the raylib library, and within I kid you not, I think it was like 5 minutes or something like that. Like, it was really quick. My merge request got accepted, and those changes are now in Raylib. So whenever the next official release comes out, those changes will be in there. Although I guess if you just downloaded the dev build, it would be in there also. So I think it is kind of interesting and kind of cool that for as much as I've praised Raylib over the past few years as I've talked about this video game project, I personally never envisioned myself being a contributor to the project, but I guess technically speaking now, I can officially say that I'm a Raylib contributor, although I guess that does have to come with the caveat that my contribution was quite minimal, to say the least, since it was 2 lines of code and 1 commit, which actually, if you look at the source code, technically my change is no longer in there. And what I mean by that is the change that I made, it was pulled in and accepted by the main Raylib developer, and then he did some additional digging into what the issue was and supplied a different solution, which was different from mine, that he just added on top of my solution. So he essentially removed my solution and created a different one. Essentially what happened was, so I mentioned the issue was a cast from the constant array. So essentially he just removed the const from the array, and it ended up working fine without needing to do that additional cast at the end. So technically it's not my change that's actually will be in the latest release, but at the same time it was also my change which spurred it to be in the latest release. So I don't know. Take it as you will, but the thing I was saying about my contribution being very minimal is if you actually look at the Raylib source code, I believe, at least as of recording, there's over 7,000 commits. So 1 commit of 2 lines is basically nothing in the grand scheme of things, but it's still a cool thing to say that I'm a Raylib contributor, which, now that I think of it, it wasn't all that long ago how I was raving about how I was a contributor to Jeff Geerling's top 500 benchmark thing, and I was super hyped and pumped about that. Although technically, if we're ranking grand achievements when it comes to open source development, I would definitely have to say that's still number 1, because those changes actually kind of meant something in the grand scheme of things, and are actually still used. Even though I guess you could technically still argue my Raylib contribution was used, at least the thought or principle of it anyway. But the one I did for Jeff Geerling's contribution, that is of course still used, since it's adding additional operating system support to that top 500 benchmark, which we did an entire podcast episode about that. So if you're interested, you can check that out. So that was the main updates that I wanted to talk about as far as the video game's concerned. And we're not done, because the past couple weeks we've talked quite a bit about Ansible, and I was back at it again this week with even more Ansible. And this week I decided to write a playbook to allow me to clone virtual machines on any of my Proxmox servers. So before this, I had a playbook to initialize a new server or a new virtual machine that I already made. So I have 3 essentially template images, where I have a Ubuntu image, a Arch image, and a Red Hat image. So essentially, if I ever want a new server based on Ubuntu, I can just clone the Ubuntu VM, and it's already ready to go. I can just run this init playbook, and it'll do all the things like configuring a new user, changing the IP address, resetting the SSH keys, all that good stuff. But I always had to manually clone the VM, which that's manual work and extra steps, and that's just not acceptable. So I decided to write a Ansible playbook to do it all for me. So what the playbook does is quite simple. It basically just shuts down the VM I'm trying to clone. It runs the Proxmox command to clone the virtual machine with the new name that I want to give it. and then it starts that new cloned machine up. And then if I wanted to, I could, in combination with my other Ansible playbook to initialize a virtual machine, run that against the VM that just got created, and bingo bango, in 2 commands, I have created a brand new virtual machine ready to go to host whatever it is that I want to host. Now, I say 2 commands, but in reality, if I really wanted to, which who knows, I might actually end up doing this, I could write a simple bash script that essentially takes in all the, or even use it based on a config file. I don't know, but essentially morph these 2 commands into 1 command, because 2 commands obviously is way too many, right? You just got to do it in one. But essentially, you could do it either through command line arguments or some kind of config file that would essentially run both of these playbooks back to back to fully set up a virtual machine in one single command. And it'd honestly be quite easy, because how the playbooks are configured, the first one takes in which virtual machine you want to clone. Now, technically, you could clone anyone, but in combination with the init script, there's really only 3 choices: the Ubuntu VM, the Arch VM, or the Red Hat VM. And based on which server you're trying to initialize, there's only support for Ubuntu, Arch, and Red Hat. So essentially, you can basically say which one you want to initialize, and it'll know exactly which one to clone, because there's a 1-to-1 correlation there. So it'd be pretty trivial to implement some kind of script or some kind of wrapper to essentially make this 2 command function into a 1 command function. But haven't made that yet, although it wouldn't surprise me if that's something that does end up happening, because if we're complaining about doing something as trivial as cloning a virtual machine in the Proxmox GUI, who could even be bothered by having to write 2 commands in the terminal when you could just write 1? But anyway, moving into the main topic for this week's episode. So Microsoft held an event last week, and personally, I think our topic last week that we had about the Apple Developer Transition Kit was much more interesting, at least to me, which is why I didn't talk about the Microsoft event last week. But the reason why I'm bringing it up this week is since there has been quite the eruption from the privacy and security community over various privacy and security concerns about the standout feature that Microsoft announced that they're calling Recall. And before we declare that the sky is falling, let's get something straight here. If you're using a Windows computer right now, I can almost guarantee you that this feature will not apply to the current hardware that you have, because unless you are somehow already rocking the new Snapdragon X Elite chip, you will not even be able to have access to this recall feature, because this recall feature only applies to what Microsoft is calling their Copilot PCs, which currently are only PCs powered by the aforementioned Snapdragon X Elite chip due to the neural processing units, or NPUs, that it has built into it. So I guess in theory, if there was ever a mainline support for Windows on ARM for Apple Silicon chips, theoretically they could use maybe the neural engine from them to enable this feature, but who knows if that's ever going to happen. But getting more specifically into the system requirements, as mentioned, you need at least that Snapdragon X Elite chip, although I would assume as more chips come out that have these neural processing units, they will also be supported as well. But Microsoft also mentions you need at least 8 logical processors, a minimum of 256 gigs of hard drive space, and at least 50 gigs available, and then 16 16 gigs of RAM. So, but like I mentioned, this recall feature, unless you're planning on buying a new computer with one of these, like Snapdragon X Elite chips, or potentially a chip in the future that would have these neural processing units, you don't have to worry about this feature ever coming to your device. But specifically, let's get into how it works to try to understand where this sky is falling mentality that Microsoft is going to be spying on you and the world is coming to an end. So first off, how Recall works is it takes screenshots, or as Microsoft says, snapshots of your screen every few seconds. Specifically, I think it's 5 seconds, but regardless, every few seconds, this recall feature is taking essentially screenshots of what you're doing on your computer. So according to Microsoft, quote, you can use recall to locate the content you have viewed on your PC using search or on a timeline bar that allows you to scroll through your snapshots. So essentially, it'll take a bunch of screenshots of your computer, and then you can essentially search for something. So for instance, if you were browsing, say, like Amazon or something for, I don't know what you were browsing for. Say you were looking for like some kind of computer cables or something, and then you closed out of that window and you came back to it the next day and you forgot what kind of cable you were looking for. You could, in theory, ask the recall feature, hey, what was that cable I was looking up on Amazon the other day, and it would show you. So according to Microsoft, also users can pause, stop, or delete captured content and can exclude specific apps or websites. They also say that allegedly Recall won't take snapshots of in-private web browsing sessions or digital rights management, or DRM, protected content. But what Recall won't do is it will not actively hide sensitive information like passwords or financial account numbers that appear on screen. So if you're doing any kind of like banking, or you're entering passwords that don't have the auto hide feature enabled, your passwords and banking information will be in clear text in screenshots on your computer. So take that as you will. But by default, it snapshots everything, and you have to manually configure things you don't want to be snapshotted. Or if you want to disable it, you have to do that yourself because it's enabled by default. So if you do want any apps or websites to not be included in this recall feature, you have to manually go into the settings and add those, which, depending on how many apps or websites you want to be excluded, could potentially be a very tedious process. And as I mentioned, this feature is, well, I guess depending on who you are, it's not a feature. But this feature, nonetheless, this feature is enabled by default. So if you don't want it, you have to actually manually disable it. But again, before we declare the sky is falling, just remember that this is only coming to Copilot Plus PC devices and not just your standard typical Windows computer that exists right now. Now, getting into the addressing the privacy in related areas. So, quote, so is this a privacy nightmare? According to Microsoft, quote, well, yes, but actually no. That is a quote from Microsoft. Probably. Of course, I'm referencing that meme where the guy's like, well, yes, but actually no. Microsoft didn't actually say any of that. I'm just saying that, of course, they will not say it's a privacy nightmare, of course. But the idea here is this idea of consistently screenshotting everything you do is actually how some versions of spyware work. So in a way, the people that are calling this recall feature spyware aren't technically wrong, in the sense that it is performing functions that spyware typically does. I have heard some interesting commentary that that taking a bunch of screenshots isn't really that smart in like being able to recall things, but I guess you got to capitalize on AI where you can. But according to Microsoft, the snapshots are encrypted and saved on your PC's hard drive. So assuming that this is true, that they're all encrypted and saved locally on your machine, that is definitely something that's very good for privacy and kind of goes against the it's a privacy nightmare argument. However, it is my understanding though that the encryption for these snapshots is only available if you actually have BitLocker or their device encryption enabled. Now, to Microsoft's credit, though, I believe in a recent Windows update, they're essentially making device encryption and BitLocker essentially default, so it'll be on by default. Whether you get grandfathered into this, I guess, is to be seen. But again, because this will only be coming on new computers, because it's enabled by default, you would essentially have to make the conscious decision to disable the device encryption. So from that standpoint, unless you disable it, all this data should be encrypted. But again, as we touched on in our cybersecurity tip, if your device is unlocked, those images are not encrypted, and the encryption will only, of course, work when your device is, properly shut down and whatnot. So also, according to Microsoft, your snapshots are not sent to Microsoft, and Recall AI processes Recall API. Excuse me, I cannot talk. Recall AI processing occurs locally, and your snapshots are securely stored on your local device only. So, if we are to believe Microsoft's claims here, your snapshots are never sent to Microsoft. They never go to their cloud for additional analyzing to identify what you're doing. In theory, they don't have any of this data tied to your user account. All the data is processed locally, and like I said, the snapshots are also stored locally. So I guess the question becomes, do you believe them? Now, I don't doubt their claim that the AI processing happens locally on the device, especially given their strict requirement that you need to have a chip with these NPUs or neural processing units on it, because without that, of course, you can't do any of the processing locally. So I definitely don't doubt the fact that they are doing this AI processing locally, because if anyone has seen the reviews for the Rabbit R1 or the Humane AI pen, you know how basically borderline unusable AI devices are that have to reach out to the cloud for every single request that you ask it in order to get a response before it tells you the answer. Because if you've seen any of those reviews about the Rabbit R1 or the Humane AI pen, it's honestly kind of laughable how, the person or the reviewer will ask it a question and then it's basically silence for like 5 seconds or more before the thing actually responds with the answer. So if this was all being done through the cloud, it definitely would be really not ideal. So having it all done locally is definitely a benefit, not only for privacy but also for usability and speed, because if you can do it all locally, that's of course going to be a lot quicker than having to send all those requests to the cloud. Now, with that said, anyone that has installed or even set up a new Windows machine in the past few years is probably well aware of the fact of that massive list of things you have to uncheck if you don't want Windows to collect various information about you and send back to Microsoft. In other words, known as the telemetry data that Windows likes to collect. Not to mention the fact that when you do open up or create a fresh install of Windows, all those various ads that they pre-include in Windows and all the various targeted ads that they push through the OS itself, which, depending on how you have your, I guess, data collection enabled, are actually personalized and targeted ads. And the other, I guess, feature in regards to the privacy component is this recall data is also secured in part by Microsoft's Pluton security processor, which is a, quote, chip-to-cloud security technology, which that is a rather interesting name. According to Microsoft, the chip provides hardware-based root of trust, secure identity, and cryptographic services. So basically, it seems like Microsoft, from kind of what my reading through this, what this Pluton security processor is, it kind of seems like a replacement for the TPM chip, or the Trusted Platform Module, which was something that they had required, I believe, the TPM 2.0 variant for Windows 11 systems. And essentially, in a nutshell, the TPM was basically a way to securely store things like, for example, cryptographic keys, for instance. So essentially what this chip-to-cloud thing, how Microsoft describes it, is essentially kind of that plus more. Now, in trying to actually dig into what chip-to-cloud actually means, I found a DevOps.com article that basically described it as this: chip-to-cloud chipsets are always connected to the cloud. So that might seem a little concerning to some of you out there. I would say rightly so. But one of the benefits, or proposed benefits, of these chip-to-cloud, I guess, chips, if you will, is it prevents spoofing of devices. And essentially what this means is if your device at the hardware level is directly connected to the cloud through some kind of authentication server, if another device comes along, if let's say a threat actor comes along and like clones your hard drive or something, and by doing so has completely cloned all of your authentication, all your VPN connections, all that kind of thing, if they try to then log into some of those services, if you have this chip to cloud, hardware component, essentially the cloud will be able to identify that, hey, this person claims to be so and so, but they don't have their, the same hardware chip. Thus, I know this actually isn't them, and they can, handle that accordingly. So that's essentially kind of one of the big, at least in my opinion, one of the big kind of draws to something like this chip to cloud chip, if you will, including it in devices. Now, of course, this also means that with these Pluton security processors, you are always going to be connected to the Microsoft cloud. So I guess take that as you will. But this also isn't something specifically regulated to these Copilot Plus PCs. I believe AMD also announced that some of their new chips are going to have this Microsoft Pluton security processor enabled with them also. So it's not just something that's coming to like the Snapdragon X Elite chips. So that is kind of in a nutshell the whole recall feature. So I guess to summarize here, it's an AI tool that takes screenshots of your computer screen and then allows you to ask it questions about what was on your screen, and it can intelligently look through those screenshots and I'd be able to identify things to give you results to help you recall what you were doing on your device. Now, I've kind of, I guess, sprinkled in here some of my thoughts kind of like ad hoc like, but what do I actually think about this feature? Now, it probably doesn't come at a surprise that I'm skeptical, but what I will say is if Microsoft's claims are actually true, that of course being that none of this data is actually sent to the cloud and everything is done and stored locally on device, I think it's honestly a pretty cool feature. Like, bias aside, whether you like Microsoft or not, the ability to be able to have, the functionality to be able to remember what you were doing on your computer if you forgot something is honestly quite powerful. Whether it's, like for a code perspective, if it's constantly taking screenshots of your code and you accidentally deleted something, you could potentially get it to recall that. So potentially a cool feature. Or you could use something like Git, for instance, or some kind of version control. But there is, of course, the instance where you haven't committed your changes to version control and you delete something and you forget what it was, and you made changes since then, so hitting Control Z over and over again won't actually get it back. So there are some potential use cases where it could be viable, but just in general, kind of the ability to be able to remember stuff. Because I'm not sure about you guys, but I know I'm pretty sure everyone's experienced this, where like you have like an idea of something you want to look up in your head, for instance, and then maybe you're looking it up or something, and then you have to go away to do something else, and then you kind of come back and you forget what you were wanting to do, or just in general, you have this idea in your mind of what you want to do, and then like you walk into another room and you kind of forget why you walked into that room, short-term memory, things like that. So this could potentially help alleviate some things like that. So I definitely think it is a cool feature, and at the very least, it's like a cool party trick, right? But at the end of the day, that is assuming that Microsoft's claims are true. If they aren't true and they are actually sending this data in some or part back to the Microsoft servers, then you have the argument that this is just spyware. Because at the end of the day, what is spyware? It's some piece of malicious piece of software that essentially monitors what you do. And that is, in essence, what this recall feature is doing. Now, can you call it spyware even if it's all this stuff is being done locally? Since technically there is a program on your computer that is spying on everything that you do, which you could make the argument it's not, because it's helping you to remember things if you forgot. But if it's going off to Microsoft, for instance, that data, then I would argue that it is spyware, because some corporation is viewing everything you do on your computer. Now, again, if it's all done locally, you kind of lose the malicious component of the argument to make it considered spyware. But of course, that's assuming it's all done locally. Now, the reason why I kind of keep touching on this, if these claims are to be true, thing is, first off, none of this code is open source, so no one can actually verify any of Microsoft's claims to actually be true. So you basically just have to trust them. And the reason why it is kind of more is Microsoft's less than stellar track record when it comes to respecting user privacy. Just view the thing we mentioned earlier in the episode about all the various telemetry data that Microsoft collects on its users. So with their less than stellar track record, and the fact that you can't independently verify their claims to be true, it is kind of hard to, at face value, take them at their claims. Now, not to sound like an Apple apologist or anything, but let's be real, Apple falls into the same category that Microsoft does. They make claims about privacy and security, but all their code is proprietary, so you can't actually verify their claims are true. However, the difference between Apple and Microsoft, at least in this case, is Apple doesn't, religiously collect data and sell, collect telemetry data about their users and, sell it to third parties to sell, ads within the operating system itself. So there are some differences there that give Apple, at least in my opinion, a little more credibility to their various privacy and security claims, and they have a little bit more of a track record when it comes to their various privacy and security claims, at least compared to Microsoft, in my personal opinion. So that's why I kind of find it a little bit harder to trust these claims at face value. But again, as I've mentioned plenty of times, I do think if their claims are true, it definitely is super cool. Now, with that said, personally, I'm not sure I'll actually ever end up owning one of these Copilot Plus PC devices. And if I did ever end up owning one, I'm not sure I'd end up using this feature anyway, because I feel like if I did end up getting one of these Copilot Plus PC devices that would have recall, I'd probably just disable the feature for a couple reasons. One, out of just pure paranoia, and two, having a background process like that that's constantly, essentially always processing and always doing some kind of task, but I feel like could potentially bog down the system. Now, I understand that it would be using the whole neural processing units, which is a completely separate portion of the chip than the actual like CPU or GPU or anything like that. So in theory, you shouldn't have any kind of degradation to your day-to-day performance, but you definitely would have at least a little more. You could make the argument power draw because the chip's constantly doing work. So in that regard, I'm the kind of person that, whenever I use Windows, which albeit isn't all that often in my personal life, I like to have as few processes running as possible. It's like a golf score. You want to have it as low as you can. Because it wasn't really all that long ago where if you go into like an older Windows operating system, like if you go back to like Windows 7 or Windows XP, like the number of processes that are running actively when you're just sitting on the desktop compared to how many processes are running now on a stock Windows installation is absolutely insane. Like I believe Windows XP, the last time I used it, I think the number of processes was like 5 maybe, and I think Windows 7 was maybe like in the low 20s. And nowadays on a stock Windows install, you're looking at close to 200, I think. And even if you use something like Chris Titus's, debloat Windows tool, like you're, at least in how I configure it anyway, I'm still like just shy of 100 processes. And that's with like stripping out a bunch of the various telemetry data and other stuff that Microsoft includes that I don't want. But yeah, so just having another process on top of that in theory would be fairly intensive, although if you're using the neural processing units, there should be some hardware acceleration stuff going on there. So in theory, it shouldn't draw a ton of like excess power, but it's still like another process that's running in the background. But anyway, I think I've kind of rambled on enough about this. The TLDR is, it's cool, in my opinion, if Microsoft's claims are true. Otherwise, it's what all the privacy and security people have been crying to the hills about, that it is spyware. So that is the main Microsoft event, the new feature that's coming to the fancy new Copilot Plus PCs. But before we leave today, let's get back to our trivia question. So Google used to sell a server called the Google Search Appliance, which was a rack-mountable server based on what famous enterprise server family? If you said the Dell PowerEdge, congratulations, you are correct. And if you want some bonus points, if you said specifically the 700 series, you get the bonus point, because the Google Search Appliance, it started with the Dell PowerEdge R710 and then went through the R730, so it also included the R720. But after the R730, it was, like all good Google products, discontinued. So that was your trivia question. Hopefully you got it right. And if you enjoyed this episode, I ask that you leave it a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And be sure to share it with a friend or family member. We had a lot of good various cybersecurity related stuff that I think you probably might want to share with some friends and family. And if you have any questions about this episode or have any comments or topics for future episodes, if you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below, or you can always shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, and the link for that is down in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.